Welcome to this presentation that will explain to you the method section when preparing a research paper. Note that this explanation is very much centered around accounting education research. I hope that you enjoy the presentation and that you've learnt a lot throughout. You can now go to the next slide. In the method section, you will be addressing two main things. The first thing you will be addressing in your method section is what you did. The second thing you will also be looking at is how you did what you did. The what part of your method section will be driven by the research approach that you have followed. For the purposes of doing accounting education research, you could follow either a qualitative approach or a quantitative approach or a mixed method approach. These approaches will be explained in more detail later on in the presentation. In the second part of the second section of your method section, you will also be doing the how explanations of your method. This part will give a step-by-step account of what you did. You might ask why it is important to have the what and how parts of your method section. These are important because it is the DNA of your research paper. It explains to the reader of your research paper exactly what you did in performing your research. This is particularly important either when a researcher wants to replicate a study, or it could also be important for the purposes of understanding and analyzing the findings of your research. In order to properly analyze the results of your research, the reader would need to understand exactly what you did when performing your research. In the next part of the presentation, we will be taking it a little bit further in understanding the various methods and the what part, in other words, the qualitative method versus the quantitative method or the mixed method when performing accounting education research. In the previous slide, we spoke about the what part of your method section, and we said that the what part of your method section is influenced by the type of research method you choose to use. The types of methods that you can make use of is either a qualitative research methodology, a quantitative research methodology, or a mixed methodology. In the next video, we will watch a video that explains the differences between these three so that you have a better understanding of the three different research methods. Enjoy the video on the next slide. Let's watch this next video presentation that will give you a good overview of the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. It will also briefly explain to you what it means to use a mixed method approach.
When doing research, you often have to choose between quantitative and qualitative research. In this video, I'll explain the differences between the two. Hi, I'm Jessica from Scribber, here to help you achieve your academic goals. Let's start with the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research allows you to test hypotheses, so you can expect to see data collected with this approach will mainly be expressed in numbers and graphs. It also requires a larger sample size. These numbers are then analyzed through math and statistical analysis. On the other hand, qualitative research allows you to formulate a hypothesis. So yes, opposite to quantitative research, this approach will yield data that's expressed in words and also require fewer respondents. The data is then analyzed by summarizing, categorizing, and interpreting. Alright, now we know the differences, but when to use which? It's very simple. If your goal is to confirm or test a theory or a hypothesis, you're most likely going to opt for the quantitative approach. But if you want to understand or explore an idea, then you should go for the qualitative approach. There's also a third approach, which combines quantitative with qualitative. And this is called the mixed method. Let's see how it applies in a concrete example, shall we? Say we want to find out how satisfied students are in their studies. I'll show you how both approaches can answer this question. If I'm taking the quantitative approach, I can survey 300 students at the university and ask them questions like, on a scale from 1 to 5, how satisfied are you with your professors? With the collected data, I will run a statistical analysis and draw conclusions that might sound something like, on average, students rate their professors 4.4 out of 5. But if I want to go for a qualitative approach, then I can conduct interviews with 15 students and ask them open-ended questions such as, how satisfied are you with your studies? Or, what can be done to improve the study program? Then, I transcribe the interviews and try to find patterns or recurring themes. For example, something like students would like to have more one-on-one guidance from their professors. For the mixed method approach, you first conduct interviews with the students. Through that, you gain new insights and come up with a hypothesis. For example, you learn through interviews that students prefer individual assignments over group projects. Then you test whether this applies to a larger scale of students using survey research. It's also possible to do it the other way around. You can start out with a survey to see the bigger picture, then use interviews to understand the reason behind it. Now, I will go over data collection for both approaches in this video very briefly, but if you want to know more, just check the article in the description. To collect quantitative data, you can, for example, survey people online, in person, or over the phone, conduct experiments, or observe subjects. On the other hand, collecting qualitative data can be quite different. You can do an interview, get a focus group, do a case study, or a literature review. And that's it for this video. If you've learned something, give this video a like, and if you have any question, ask away and I will reply. See you in our next video.
That video presentation was very informative, and it gave us a brief understanding of the differences between qualitative and quantitative research, as well as what it means to follow a mixed method approach. Let's take that information and look a little bit deeper into some of the other differences that there are between quantitative and qualitative research. So we know that when we do accounting education research, we can follow either a quantitative or a qualitative approach, or even a mixed method approach. Let's look at the quantitative research approach and compare it with some of the things that we see when we look at a qualitative approach in accounting education research. Right, firstly, when we look at quantitative research helps us to answer what questions and examines the relationship between variables. Let's think of an example in accounting education research. If I were to implement a new educational approach for my accounting students, I might want to know what the impact of that new educational approach is. In other words, did it improve their academic performance? So in order to answer what the implication of this new educational approach is, I might follow a quantitative research method approach. This will help me to examine the relationship between the implementation of this new educational approach and its impact on student academic performance. If I, for example, find, or there's research that has already shown that there is a positive influence for this new educational approach on students' academic performance, I might want to know why this is the case. If my research question was around why this might be happening, I may need to follow a qualitative research approach. Because qualitative research approaches allow me or give me the opportunity to answer why questions. This is because qualitative research explores the meaning of people's experiences. So when I do a qualitative research paper, I may now be able to explore why my students have actually performed better. It might be because they enjoyed the new educational approach that was implemented, and because of that enjoyment that the students are having in this new method, that's what is allowing them to spend more time on accounting, and therefore they're doing a little bit better. So there, when I answer the why questions, I could do surveys or interviews with my students and try and explore why it is that this new educational approach might be allowing them or causing them to perform better. All right, so research questions that are under my quantitative research approach answer what, how, and does questions. So we've spoken about an example of what. We could also look at how something influences something else, again, looking at the relationship, and does the implementation of this new accounting approach maybe influence my students' academic performance. Quantitative research can also be descriptive or exploratory in nature. When we talk about descriptive in nature, it can look at how much, how often, relationships between, and differences between various things. So we could, for example, have a look at maybe my research question is looking at if I have feedback implemented into my accounting education approach, how much more time are my students actually spending on accounting? So that might be a research question there, just as an example of some of the research questions under the quantitative approach. All right, the other thing that's important to realize about quantitative research approaches is there is usually a hypothesis or a prediction of what you think might be happening. And it is important that you write up your hypothesis as part of your research method. The development of your hypothesis will be discussed in more detail when you do your archival research workshop, where they will give you a very good explanation on the development of hypotheses, how these predictions come about, and how to actually write it up in your research method. If we move on again then to qualitative research, if we look at qualitative research, those research questions are more exploratory in nature. They normally want to find out why or how something happened. Like I said earlier, if I know that some kind of educational approach is beneficial to students' academic performance, I might want to know why that is the case or how that happened. What was it that actually caused that to happen? So that might be part of my research question when I follow a qualitative approach. And then normally, because research questions, when we follow the qualitative approach, are exploratory in nature, they usually do not have a prediction or a hypothesis. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, in the previous slide, we had a look at the differences between the purposes for using quantitative versus qualitative research methodologies, and we also had a look at the different research questions that you would find under these two different research methods. Right, so what we're going to do in this slide now is we're going to have a look at the differences in the data that we collect under quantitative methodologies versus qualitative methodologies. So in the quantitative, or under the quantitative research methodology, the data we collect normally consists of numbers. And these numbers can come from various instruments. The first kind of instrument we'll look at is your Likert scale surveys. So with Likert scale surveys, we basically ask students to rate their experiences of something, or maybe rate how likely they are to recommend to another student that they should use this new learning methodology because they feel it's very effective. Or maybe we could ask them to rate how effective they think this new learning method is in improving their academic performance. So we would get numbers from those rating scales, and then we would use that to basically do our analysis. Then we can also get data from, for example, pre and post tests. So we could maybe test the academic performance of our students prior to the implementation of some kind of new academic academic method that we're going to be using to teach our students, and how successful this thing is. We would actually want to measure what was their academic performance prior to the implementation of this new educational approach, and then what is their academic performance post the implementation of this academic approach, to actually determine maybe what the influence of that new approach is on their academic performance. Then we can also get we'll also get data to be able to do some statistical analysis. So maybe statistics in the sense that we want to determine how well first language students did in relation to second language students. So we would maybe collect some data with regards to that, and that might also be academic performance. So those are just some of the examples of the numbers in terms of data that we can get when we use quantitative research methodologies. When we make use of qualitative research methodologies, there our data normally consists of words. So we would get words from interviews that we have maybe with our students, or journals that we ask them to keep of their experiences of some kind of academic educational approach that we've now used, and maybe even just observing and writing down in words what we observe from the students. So maybe we implement a new tutoring approach, so we observe maybe so maybe the whole idea of the new tutoring approach is to improve student engagement with one another, and maybe even with the tutor. And so what we might do is we might observe what the interactions look like in the previous, in the old tutoring method that we used, and then in the new tutoring method that we implement, what did we observe students are doing in terms of engagement? How are they engaging and interacting maybe with one another? Then we can also make use of ethnography, where the researcher actually goes into the field. I'm not going to go into too much detail with regards to ethnography now. I will post a little video for you maybe, so that you can also just go and watch that in your own time, that explains what ethnography is and examples of how the researcher actually goes into the field to collect data. All right, we'll move on to the next slide after this. Okay, we'll now be focusing on some of the differences in terms of the analysis that we do under the quantitative versus the qualitative research methodologies. When we have a look at quantitative research, when we do quantitative research, our analysis is normally done using statistics, so where we crunch the numbers. So we would look at making use of different statistical analysis techniques, say for example making use of regressions, ANOVAs and COVAs, and all kinds of statistical measures to actually, or means to be able to analyze the data. What's also important to note with regards to quantitative data analysis is that the analysis is normally deductive in nature. So if we have a look there, you'll see deductive says that the data is formed with the use of theory or established views. So for example, when you use regression analysis, you normally start with theory. You then build a hypothesis, and then the hypothesis indicates to you what you want to test. So what you predict might be happening, and then you actually do the research to test whether or not what your prediction was does actually occur. So you start with theory, and you use the theory to build your hypothesis, and you then test the hypothesis. And then you analyze the data to see whether or not it supports your hypothesis. So with deductive research, we start with the theory and we move to the actual observations. On the other hand, when we now look at qualitative research, with qualitative research, the analysis a lot of the times has to do with the creation of themes. So basically, we spoke about just now in the previous slide that the researcher will get data, and the data that the researcher gets is normally in the form of words. So what the researcher will then do is he will start working through the words and the sentences that he got and starts looking for themes. So maybe, for example, when you do interviews with the students about, why they enjoyed something, it might, a lot of students maybe, for example, say something about the fact that it caused them to work together in teams, or it helped them to reach out to friends, or because of this new research methodology, they got together with some of their other students that they normally see in class, and they go sit in the library together, and then they work together. So because of those different answers, we might start picking up this theme that whatever it is that we've done has maybe actually led to some collaboration happening between the students. And so maybe by analyzing the data in the form of the words that we get, we start seeing some kind of patterns or themes emerging from the data that actually gives us an indication as to why maybe the students are enjoying this, or what they think is actually leading to maybe the improvement in their academic performance because of whatever it is that we've done. The only thing that does also happen when you are analyzing qualitative data and you have to look for these themes is it is a time-consuming exercise, and it is something that researchers need to take into consideration in planning their research and what it is that they want to do. The other thing I also just want to highlight that is important to note is you'll remember just now under the quantitative research methodology, we spoke about about the fact that there we use deductive approaches. So we normally start with the theory, and then we build the hypotheses, and then we test the hypotheses and get the observations. When we work with qualitative research methodologies, on the other hand, we normally make use of inductive research. So with inductive research, if you have a look, it says that the data is formed without the use of theory or established views. So here, the data actually starts to speak for itself. So you don't start with a theory first. You first get the observations, and then you draw from the observations the themes, and then the theme starts identifying for you some kind of answer or theory that can be developed from that in terms of explaining why something is happening the way that it is happening. So just to give a bit of a better explanation of the difference between deductive and inductive research, on the next slide you'll see there's a short little video that you can watch with regards to that, but this is just a highlight of some of the differences in terms of the analyses that we do between quantitative and qualitative research. As I mentioned in the previous slide, here is just a short video that gives you a explanation of the difference between deductive and inductive research. And again, you can just press on the screen to start playing the video, and then once you're finished, you can move on to the next slide.
In this video, I will briefly describe the difference between deductive and inductive logic. I will also explain the connections between the two and show how both kinds of logic are important for knowledge production. In fact, they can be envisioned as integral parts of an overall cycle of research, as both connect theory with empirical observations. Deductive logic is sometimes referred to as a top-down approach because it starts with abstract theory, which we often envision as higher, and then moves to specific empirical observations. When researchers use deductive logic, they first start with a broad theory. They then articulate specific hypotheses to test that theory, and then systematically collect data by which they can test their hypotheses. If the data support the hypotheses, then the theory is also supported, but it's not proved either. If the data do not support the hypothesis, then the theory is not supported, but it's also not disproved. So for example, let's say that I have a theory that women are smarter than men. I would then need to generate some hypotheses or predictions to test that theory. Hypotheses are always stated as if-then statements. So I might say, if women are smarter than men, then they should have higher GPAs. I would then look at the GPAs at both women and men within a particular setting and see if there's a difference. This is my empirical observation. If women's GPAs were on average higher than men's, then my hypotheses or prediction would be supported, and that could then potentially also support my theory. Note that the data would not and cannot prove or disprove my theory. Instead, it can only support or not support my theory. So the goal here is to test theory. And to do this best, this usually involves statistical analysis in large numbers of cases. In contrast, inductive logic is sometimes referred to as bottom-up logic. Here, researchers start with making broad empirical observations. The goal here is to build theory, not to test it. Often, not always, inductive research involves qualitative data, so looking at a few cases with the eye towards deep, nuanced, and a meaningful understanding of those cases. So for example, a researcher who is interested in student learning may observe students in classrooms and also talk with them after class about their experiences. The researcher may then begin to find patterns in terms of some students being more likely to participate in some classes than others. After collecting sufficient amount of empirical data, the researcher may then be able to start making some tentative hypotheses to explain these patterns. And from there, a theory of classroom engagement and success may begin to be built. In sum, when researchers use deductive logic, they first start with a broad theory and then articulate specific hypotheses to test that theory, and then systematically collect data by which they can test their hypotheses. When researchers use inductive logic, they start with observations and from there start to see patterns and from there start to develop theory. In truth, people are often using both kinds of logic simultaneously. We both come into situations with existing ideas about the world, and we also hopefully are open to collecting new information to then revise our existing ideas about the world. But it is important from a researcher perspective to be able to differentiate between the two in order to systematically evaluate the process by which we are making our conclusions.
Okay, in this slide, I'm just going to quickly be discussing with you the differences between your reporting, so your actual findings. How does the final report kind of differ between the quantitative versus the qualitative research methodologies? If we look under the quantitative research methodology approach, there your report will normally be a lot more rigid. It's going to have a lot of statistical reporting in because your findings will generally be based in a statistical format, and that's because your data was in numbers, and so obviously to analyze your data you make use of a lot of statistical techniques, and so the findings are actually represented in a statistical format, and then your findings are basically the interpretation of those statistical results. On the other hand, when we look at qualitative research findings, so the final report we write there, it will be a lot more narrative. It's also a lot of the times written in first person. You're interpreting, so basically you're now talking about the themes that you find and what those themes actually might be saying or identifying for you in terms of answering your research question. There's a lot of writing, and also it contains a lot of quotes because you're trying to show what underneath your themes, maybe what were the kinds of things that the students were saying underneath those various themes, so that whoever the reader of your research is can see how you came to the conclusion that you actually came to. So that's just some of the main differences that you're going to find in your final report or your findings section of your research paper. Okay, we can move on then to the next slide as soon as you've read through that and you're happy with these descriptions. You may now be wondering, but how do I write a method section and what needs to be included in my method section? Here is a video that will give us a brief explanation of the things that you should make sure are covered and have been included in your method section. Let's watch this video.
The method section describes everything that was done in a study. You should include enough detail that another researcher could read that section and completely replicate your research. Most method sections include at least 4 types of information. Number 1, participants or subjects. Who participated in your study? Were they college students, young children, or older adults? How many were there? How were they recruited? And did they receive anything in return for their participation? And do you have any demographic information? The key here is to completely describe your sample. Number 2, design. What were the independent and dependent variables in the study? How are they defined? Was the independent variable measured within subjects or between subjects? And how is the dependent variable measured? You should clearly describe each of these details. Number 3, materials. What did your participants interact with? What were the materials? How did you get them? If you used a variety of materials, how many did you use? The key here is to clearly describe each of the materials you used so that someone else could easily replicate your design. Number 4, procedure. What did your participants do? You'll need to describe everything that happened in complete detail. This includes when and where the study took place, what happened and in what order, and any other information that would be needed to replicate your study. Now, depending on the type of study you did, you may need to include even more information. This may seem challenging at first, but you can write almost any method section using this very simple procedure. First, make a list of all of the different types of information that someone would need to replicate your work. Then, fill out that list, using complete sentences for each information type. Organize what you have into separate subheadings in APA style, and after that, the first draft of your method section is complete. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please comment below. And for more on research papers, please visit the UCSD Psychology website.
Now that you've watched the video that explains how you write your method section and the things that need to be included in your method section, the last thing I've just included for you is a little video that explains the analysis of variance. This is a statistical technique that is used a lot in education research, so I thought it would just be a good idea for you to just have a bit of an understanding behind the ANOVA and what it actually does. I know that in your other blocks you will also be looking at regression, so I'm not going to be explaining that to you, but this is then the last thing that you need to watch, and it will just help you to understand the analysis of variance. Thank you so much for being part of this presentation, and I hope that you've learned some valuable things today. Alright, keep well and enjoy your master's program.
Let's say you want to find out if the beverage that people drink affects their reaction time. So you set up an experiment with 3 groups of people. The first group gets water to drink. The second group gets some sugary fruit juice. And the third group gets coffee. Now you test everyone's reaction time. And you want to know if there's any difference in reaction time between the groups. The null hypothesis says that the mean reaction time for all 3 groups is the same. If there were only 2 groups, you could use a t-test to find out if there's a difference between them. But when you have 3 groups or more, you need to use a different approach, the analysis of variance. When you do the experiment, the scores won't all be the same. The total variation of all the scores is made up of 2 parts. The variation within each group, because the people in each group have different reaction times, and the variation between the groups, because the drinks you gave each group are different. Here's an example. Look at this set of scores. They've been sorted into order to make it easier to see the patterns. You can see that there's a lot of variation within each group. Some people are faster and some are much slower. But all the groups look pretty much alike. There's not much variation between the groups. In this case, you'd say that most of the difference is due to the people, and the drink didn't make much of a difference. You would accept the null hypothesis, that the type of drink doesn't have any effect on reaction time. Now let's look at a different set of numbers. In this case, all the scores within each group are very close to one another. There's not a lot of variance within each group. But the groups are very different from one another. There's a lot of difference between the groups. In this case, you would reject the null hypothesis. In this case, the type of drink makes a big difference. So here's the idea behind analysis of variance. Figure out how much of the total variance comes from the between groups variance and the within groups variance. Take the ratio of between groups to within groups variance, and the larger this number is, the more likely it is that the means of the groups really are different and that you should reject the null hypothesis. In the examples, it was obvious where the variance was. Now look at these numbers. You probably can't tell if there's a significant effect because it's not clear whether there's more variance within groups or between groups, or how much. The calculations show that the ratio is 4.27, which has a probability of 0.04. So in this case, you can reject the null hypothesis. With these numbers, the drink you give the people does have an effect on their reaction time. What's that 2,12 doing there? Those are the degrees of freedom for variance between groups and variance within groups. And here's how you calculate the degrees of freedom when you report results for analysis of variance. This trick of separating the variance not only works when you have 3 or more groups, it also works when you have multiple variables. For example, if you test 3 groups for reaction time in the morning, and you test another 3 groups in the evening, an analysis of variance can tell you if there's a significant effect for the type of drink, or if the time of day makes a difference, or if there's some interaction. For example, coffee might be more effective in the morning than in the evening. So to recap, here's the main idea of analysis of variance. You figure how much of the total variance comes from between the groups and how much comes from within the groups. If most of the variation is between groups, there's probably a significant effect. If most of the variation is within groups, there's probably not a significant effect.
Thank you again for attending this presentation on the method section when preparing your research papers for accounting education purposes. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and all the best for your future studies.